Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Garibaldi Part 2 for Love and Country by Extra History. Now last time we got a background on the idea of Italian unification, and we saw some of the early exploits of Italian revolutionary Giuseppe Garibaldi. We started off with him in Italy, and then moved to Latin America, where we'll be picking up in this episode. Now, before we get into it, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
January 12th, 1840. Anita searches the battlefield for the body of her lover and the father of the baby that she still carries. Currently, she is a prisoner of Brazilian soldiers, captured in a battle where she was managing the rebel ammunition train. Her captors claim her man is dead, but do allow her to look for him with an escort. She finds no body. So, that night, driven only by blind hope, she sneaks away, steals a horse, and rides into the darkness. Gunshots crack.
I guess this is the life of a revolutionary. You know, she is Giuseppe's wife. She's pregnant with his child. She has fought in the battle and now is actively escaping from imprisonment, all once again while she is pregnant. Incredible.
Behind her, and with the thud of lead splitting meat, her horse collapses. She's thrown, landing hard. Still, she gets up, sprinting into the jungle, shouting, more gunshots, running water. Wait a minute, there's a river. She wades in, then lets the current take her away from the arguing voices. 4 long days, she wanders without food until she sees another person who takes her to a group of rebels led by the man she calls her husband, the very much alive Garibaldi.
Wow. What a journey.
Thanks so much to Factor for always keeping us extra historians well-fed fast. When Garibaldi and Anita went into the Ragamuffin War, they were both, for the first time, experiencing intense combat. But within months of Anita joining him, the couple became veterans of 2 battles. They even helped spread the revolution north to a nearby province who had also declared themselves a republic.
Hey, and I talked about this last time. When you've got these professional revolutionaries like Giuseppe Garibaldi, oftentimes they find themselves in other conflicts. Right? They gravitated towards revolutions and wars and uprisings, I think in part because some of them really had this fighting spirit, this need to keep fighting wherever they were. But also, if you expect to be fighting in, say, an Italian revolution one day, it might not be a bad idea to get some combat experience elsewhere. So when the time comes for Italy, you're ready to fight and to lead men.
And in none of these was Anita in the rear. She fought in the front rank, battling with sword and pistol and urging on any who retreated. An image that deeply appealed to the romantic Garibaldi. Because when we say romantic, we mean it with a capital R, as in the cultural movement of Romanticism, which was obsessed with heroic individualism, the exotic, the tragic, stubborn idealism, and the rejection of society's rules. Basically, Garibaldi had a flair for the dramatic and a love for imagery that belonged in a novel. And boy, oh boy, did their relationship definitely belong in a novel. They shared adventure and danger together, but also knowledge. Garibaldi was a sailor, a vocation that was rare among the rebels. But from Anita, he learned new skills that would help fashion him into an international celebrity. Raised in the gaucho cattle culture of southern Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, Anita was essentially a cowgirl.
Yeah, the gauchos were kind of the first cowboys. They had incredible drip, sombreros, ponchos, very cool looking, and they're basically what we think of as sort of cowboys in America, but they were doing that stuff first.
One of the reasons Garibaldi found her so sexy was that she was a very talented rider, skills she passed on to her man. Also, Garibaldi adapted other aspects of gaucho culture, which would become part of his signature style. He began wearing a poncho and a wide-brimmed hat.
Yeah, and he brought this style back to Europe, and everyone was like, whoa, you're looking really cool. And he's like, yeah, I've been hanging out with the gauchos in South America.
Also growing his beard out real big and bushy.
And I will say, I think some of the styles that Garibaldi cultivated would be followed by a lot of later revolutionaries. I don't necessarily know that to be a fact, but he was really influential among a lot of revolutionaries who followed. They took a lot of cues from him. So I'm thinking, why not style cues as well?
Yet this was not a novel. It was a war, and real life can take frightening turns. Like in January of 1840, when Garibaldi's forces were badly scattered by the Imperials and the pregnant Anita was captured. Because though she escaped and managed to find Garibaldi, she was very much worse for wear. Shortly afterward, while living in a safe house as soldiers combed the country for them, she gave birth to their first child. But he had been marked by her escape. His skull misshapen due to her fall from the horse we mentioned before.
Yeah.
But there, for 12 days, they got to live as a normal family.
I was gonna say, I mean, she's clearly very capable, but it's very difficult to be pregnant under those circumstances and to have a healthy birth. And then, of course, very difficult to take care of a child under those circumstances. The constant fighting, running, fleeing, physical damage that's gonna happen.
No fighting, no close scrapes, just a couple, their newborn child, and several dozen Imperial soldiers moving in on their perimeter. In perhaps the most legendary act of their lives, the pair fled on horseback, Anita clutching the baby to her as she rode with a pistol in her offhand.
God
Or
damn.
at least that's how the statue she's buried under depicts it. Because over the years, this couple was about to get extremely mythologized.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth remembering that this couple, and of course Giuseppe Garibaldi in particular, would become very, very famous. Garibaldi was known worldwide, and quite respected worldwide, both during and following his life. And so he certainly, and his wife, got up to a lot of incredible exploits, but you gotta keep in mind, some of these stories are going to be exaggerated, right? This always happens when you have someone like this who accomplishes great things, especially someone who has a flair for the dramatic, like Giuseppe Garibaldi did. And so extra stories get added on, and over time they become part of the canon of his life. They're not all necessarily true, and some of them may be over-exaggerated.
Currently, they were known as notable characters, but soon they would be upgraded to heroes, and from there to legends. Yet despite that growing notoriety, or perhaps because of it, the Rebel Republic dismissed Garibaldi from service. See, while the war was not going great for the rebels, by mid-1840, the Brazilian government had decided to negotiate. With 3,000 dead and the government needing space to deal with other uprisings, both sides were working their way towards an off-ramp. The eventual deal would convince both rebel republics to dissolve and reintegrate with Brazil in exchange for reversing the economic policies that caused the conflict in the first place. But to make that kind of deal, the rebels did need to get rid of a certain flamboyant foreign rebel. So, they gave Garibaldi 900 cattle as thanks and suggested that he kindly go somewhere else. So he and Anita went south toward Uruguay, a country that had itself.
When your revolution is over, the Italian revolutionaries showed up to fight. You don't necessarily want that guy sticking around, because he's either going to find more trouble or maybe cause more trouble.
Broken away from Brazil and given the rebels aid and support during the uprising. Eventually, they moved to Uruguay's capital of Montevideo, got married, and he continued his revolutionary life as a math teacher and occasional shipbroker. The 900 cows mostly died, sadly, which is generally the problem with using animals as currency. Garibaldi went back to obscurity, remaking a name for himself in the city's large Italian expatriate community, and occasionally doing favors for young Italy and other revolutionaries. But thankfully, that boredom was short-lived, because Uruguay also happened to be in a war, the details of which are complicated, to say the least, but to vastly oversimplify. After Uruguay won its independence, tensions simmered between the first two presidents, resulting in a civil conflict that endangered foreign trade and river access, dragging in both South American and European powers. Fleeing Montevideo, the second president of Uruguay sought backing from the dictator of Argentina, a strongman who murdered political opponents with death squads. Garibaldi had arrived just as things started to go badly for the Colorados, the leftist party ruling Montevideo. Now, for years, a French fleet had blockaded Buenos Aires, but after reaching a diplomatic solution, Argentina organized an invasion of Uruguay using both their own troops and the conservative Uruguayan Blancos faction living in exile in Argentina. By 1843.
Oh man, there's a lot going on here, and I cannot speak to it because I don't know about it. I mean, look, this is how history is, especially during this time period, but really always. You drop yourself into any sort of instance or conflict, and you're going to find a bunch of countries, factions, groups that you are not familiar with. So there's a lot going on here. I'm a little out of my depth. I can't necessarily add context. But keep in mind, Garibaldi, he's also someone who just shows up, sort of integrates himself, and then goes, you know what? I'm getting involved. Once again, we're getting more of a read on Garibaldi's character, and we're also seeing why he became so well known around the world. This man, and this is once again common for a lot of these revolutionaries, whether they be Italian revolutionaries, German revolutionaries, etc., etc. During this time period, they'd hop around the globe. They'd end up in a lot of different countries, doing a lot of different things, and so they'd end up making a lot of allies and enemies, and becoming very, very well known, and often getting into trouble wherever they went.
Montevideo was...
This is also a time when, we sort of touched on this in that Johnny Harris nationalism video I reacted to, but remember, this is also a time when borders tend to be a lot more porous than they are now, right? We live right now in a world of nation-states, these nation-states with very defined borders and etc., etc. Of course, we also live in a more connected and mobile world than ever before. That is true, but if you're a sort of errant revolutionary, during this time period, it's a lot easier then than it would be now to hop from country to country, hop on a boat to somewhere, or travel across land to somewhere. Like I said, the borders are a lot more porous. It's a lot easier to end up in a lot of different places, getting up to a whole bunch of different mischief. Maybe you'll get yourself kicked out, but you can go find your way somewhere else.
Itself under siege and would remain so for nearly 8 years, which meant that the Colorados were looking for someone with experience running a small navy, preferably, if they also came pre-installed with a large army of their own. And Garibaldi fit both of those criteria quite well. See, Montevideo was a city two-thirds comprised of foreigners, with Italians making up the largest group, 4,000 strong. And most of them were leftist Italian revolutionaries, waiting for a chance to take the fight back to the homeland. Which meant that Garibaldi needed to find a bunch of cheap uniforms quickly to cover his outfit. And
Well, if you think, look, there's a lot of reasons you could find a random Italian abroad during this era, but one of those reasons, and kind of a big reason, was that they were in exile of some sort. Maybe an official exile, maybe a self-imposed exile, but essentially there were a lot of these sort of left-wing nationalist radicals and rebels who had gotten up to trouble in a lot of the different Italian states, and had decided, or had been forced, to go somewhere else for a while. Now, like I said, that's not the only reason you'd find an Italian abroad, of course not, but you would find a lot of those types of people in a lot of different countries.
He just so happened to be in luck. Due to that Argentinian blockade cutting off exports, a massive shipment of red shirts were sitting in a warehouse. They were cheap and hardy, because originally they were made for men who worked in slaughterhouses to hide the blood. And Garibaldi's Italian Legion, who would come to be known as the Red Shirts, would use that function in full. In 1842, even before the siege of Montevideo began, Garibaldi took his flotilla of 3 small ships and went to war again, largely as a liaison to the French and British navies, who had come into the war on Uruguay's side to enforce yet another blockade on Buenos Aires. His first expedition saw him suffer a major defeat, returning to Montevideo to fundraise for more ships, but his other operations were far more successful. A little too successful, actually. At first serving as a junior partner to the British and French, he later successfully cleared Argentine forces from the upper Uruguay River and assisted in the blockade of Buenos Aires. And in doing so, he made a lot of money on the side. See, despite the fact he was not supposed to prey on commercial shipping, he did pillage enough cargo that Argentinian captains were instructed to treat him like a pirate. But you know who didn't think he was?
Well, is someone a pirate or not? That's really a question of perspective. Sort of hero revolutionary to some, pirate scoundrel to others, but Garibaldi, along with his ideological commitment to revolution and ideology, he was also getting up to some mischief and maybe some personal enrichment in there.
Was a pirate. Well, the government of Uruguay, for one. When the blockade ended and he returned to Montevideo in 1847, he was made commander of the entire defense force.
Wow.
And it was there that he earned his fame. Garibaldi's outsized personality, his romance with his soldier wife Anita, and the image of the Italian Legion and their red shirts made excellent fodder for European and American journalists filing stories about the conflict.
Right, I mean, you could imagine you're sort of a middle-class bourgeois individual in London or Paris or wherever, and, hot off the presses, the new newspaper is in. And what is it writing about? Well, you're hearing all about the Italian hero, Garibaldi, and his exploits in Uruguay and Argentina. I mean, you could imagine how much of a page-turner that was, right? How exciting that kind of stuff is. I mean, it really reads like it's straight out of the pages of a novel from the era. So, this is one of the reasons why he becomes so famous. I mean, along with his exploits themselves, right? He's a pretty influential guy. He's one of the most influential revolutionaries of Italian unification, but his exploits are also popularized by a growing news media, which is already pretty big, but only continues to grow as more money comes in and more readers flock to these newspapers, so he becomes a very well-known figure.
They talked about Garibaldi like he was a character from a novel, and his Italian Legion as mythical heroes. We are being quite literal here, for by 1849, Garibaldi had literally become a literary character when Alexandre Dumas wrote a historical novel about the siege called The New Troy, directly comparing Garibaldi and his companions to the heroes of Homer's Iliad. To Europeans and Americans, the Colorados seemed like a shining example of liberal ideals and nobility in a continent ruled by kings and military strongmen.
Right, and so it's not only newspapermen and journalists, but it's these famous writers like Alexandre Dumas who are writing these stories and, fitting in their own liberal ideals. And not to say they can't be fit in, I think they very much can in a story like this, but oftentimes these fictional or non-fictional stories are used to communicate a message. And this sort of liberal revolutionary ideology is pretty popular throughout Europe in this era.
Though the reality, of course, was more complicated. Native Uruguayans were increasingly dismayed at how foreigners like Garibaldi seemed to be staffing their whole government, and was worried about a colonial takeover. As a result, Garibaldi was...
And that's a very fair concern. That is an extremely fair concern. Today we think about Latin America. Think about meddling in Latin American politics. Who do you think of? The United States, right? Obviously. But when you're talking about this era, the U.S. still does a little bit, but this is actually a little early for American domination. During this time, you've still got a lot of European meddling. The Brits and the French in particular, they're getting up to a lot of meddling throughout Latin America. Not to mention, a lot of these countries are not that far separated from their time as colonies. And so it's a very fair concern to be worried about colonial takeover or colonial domination.
Forced to resign. But, he really didn't mind, for there was already another revolution starting to brew, this time back home in Italy. For the revolutionary year of 1848 was beginning to dawn, and his contacts told him that upheaval was about to sweep across Europe. So he gathered his wife, his growing family, plus around 70 redshirts, and stepped aboard a ship to take him back to Italy and the fight of his life. And, of course, once aboard, food for that many redshirts was a big factor.
I mean, this is 1848 we're talking about. Revolution would sweep across all of Europe. And we haven't even really been going step by step. There have been sort of small-scale uprisings and revolutions throughout Europe in the time period we've been talking about, even some small examples in Italy itself. But 1848, we're heading towards the big one.
Factor he had to think about. It really is too bad microwaves wouldn't be invented until the 1940s, or else we would know the exact folks who could have helped him out. Hey. Factor, of course, is my favorite ready to...
And like I did last time, I'll let this ad play through. I've got Extra History's video linked down below. Go check it out, give them a like, subscribe, and go check out their sponsor. Show them support for making these videos.
Eat it. With every order, I get to review Factor's rotating menu of over 30 different seasonal weekly meals, and then just pick and choose my faves. Plus, they have so many to choose from, I'm always sure that everyone in my household will get the food that they love fast. For instance, as we sunset summer, I was really craving something savory, right? So I just enjoyed their chorizo and poblano stewed black beans, which had just the right amount of kick, as you can tell by the look on my face. And with all the time that I saved, I was finally able to put up all my Halloween decorations. It's never too early. Also, I can't get over how good all Factor's add-ons are. Every time I try one, cold-pressed juices, protein shakes, wellness shots, smoothies, they all just continue to smash my expectations as illustrated here. Just head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code EXTRA.
Alright, there you go. You've got all their sponsor codes and such. Their videos linked down below. Another good episode. And we're seeing more of the Latin American exploits of Garibaldi. Of course, this is a series particularly about him. Now, through him, I imagine we're going to tell the story of Risorgimento, Italian unification, but it is a story following his life. You know, we're 2 episodes in of, I think, a 5-part series, and we haven't actually covered Italy that much, at least not in the story of Giuseppe Garibaldi, though from this point onwards, it's going to be essentially all Italy all the time. We're getting to some of the good stuff. But yeah, this was another good one. A man who traveled around the world and decided to get into any sort of revolution or conflict he found himself near. Once again, not uncommon for the era. You had a lot of guys who were doing that. Garibaldi's just one of the most famous. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With that, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.